Joining me right now, a former Democratic Congressman, Barney Frank. Thanks so much for joining us. Happy Thanksgiving weekend. A lot to talk about here. Thanks for joining us on all of this. John Conyers stepping down as ranking member of the Judiciary Committee. Let's tackle that one first. You know, amid these sexual harassment allegations, your reaction to him stepping down as a ranking member of this committee?
It was entirely appropriate, and I think credit should be given to Nancy Pelosi. It's obvious that she was a major force in persuading him to do that. I don't think John Conyers himself, unfortunately, had any inclination to do that. And I know people are a little concerned because Leader Pelosi, I guess today, described him as an icon. I'm beginning to think in some of these cases, well, we're talking about people who are more emojis than icons, but he clearly was following a two-track effort of easing the way to get him out of that. That's real leadership. She got him to step down from that position, and that's very important. Contrast that, of course, with Donald Trump, who is shilling for a man who was accused of things that, at least in quantity, are worse than we've heard about what Roy Moore has done. As I said, I think it was appropriate for John Conyers to step down. As to what happens next, I think it's essential that that settlement be made open. He agreed to a settlement. I assume it was under some confidential seal. I think it's incumbent on John Conyers, my former colleague, to waive that confidentiality, which he has a right to do. I guess the complainant doesn't, but I hope she would be willing to do that, because I think those facts ought to be made clear, and I think John Conyers has a heavy burden of proof to exonerate himself for this. But I do think that the leader took an appropriate position in saying, to the extent that the Democratic caucus confers a leadership position on someone, it's inappropriate for someone who has had to agree to that kind of settlement to continue in it.
And so you say it is up to Conyers largely in terms of revealing more details about the circumstances of that settlement. And is it your feeling that, taxpayers are owed that explanation?
Oh, absolutely. I was, frankly, I served 32 years, and I thought I knew a lot. I was surprised, not pleasantly, to find out that there was this policy of members of Congress getting taxpayer funds to settle these cases and keep them secret. I'm a great supporter of the institution. I enjoyed it. I think many of the people who are there are outstanding people. But I have been critical of this tendency of members of Congress to be a little too self-protective. For example, to invoke the Constitution to say that a criminal prosecution into some of what we do violates the protections given to the legislature. I think it is outrageous that we had this policy of, we obviously never voted on it, I never knew about it, but I think that should be changed right away. The notion that there would be taxpayer funds to cover up in these kind of settlements is a terrible idea.
Is it your feeling that stepping down as the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee is a precursor to another step, or the other step for Congressman Conyers, that potentially he would need to step down altogether?
Well, there is a distinction here, and it would depend on the nature of the abuse. That's why I think it's important that we have the settlement. Certainly it is the case, and look, we're talking now about the 2-year term to which he was elected is half over, and I think it's appropriate to have a kind of hierarchy there. No, if you have committed those kind of acts, and again, the burden of proof is on John Conyers to show that he didn't commit it, having signed the agreement. And people always say, oh, I just signed that consent agreement because I wanted to avoid litigation, like Bill O'Reilly, who claimed that he just signed an agreement to avoid litigation. It turned out it was a $32 million avoidance. I'm always skeptical of that effort to brush it aside. So it's clear that you should not be in a position of authority given to you by your colleagues. Whether or not you stay in office, though, that's really more between you and your constituents. It would depend. Obviously, there are some things that are so awful that you should have to leave. It takes a 2/3 vote, according to the Constitution, to expel someone. Only a majority to take them away a leadership position, as an example of the difference. But I would say, at the very least, I think it's on John Conyers as the onus to show his constituents why he should be reelected given this. As to whether or not he should be forced to quit or expelled, that depends very much on the nature of it, and I have no idea what's in there.
And do you believe it's contingent upon the congressman either revealing more detail himself or perhaps releasing information, from that settlement, or is it contingent upon the ethics committee process?
Well, the problem with the ethics committee is that it does take a while. And, the ethics committee has no jurisdiction over a non-member of Congress. We have had cases in the past, by the way, of people resigning from Congress in large part to kind of frustrate the ethics committee. But I think John Conyers has the burden of showing, of revealing that so people can judge. And again, resigning, it would depend on what the nature of it was. It does not appear to have been a criminal issue. Some of the allegations against Roy Moore, which people like Mitch McConnell say they believe, were criminal. But yeah, I do think he has an obligation to waive any kind of confidentiality. And why have to go through the ethics process when the facts that the ethics committee would be trying to find out are in that settlement?
Do you empathize with Nancy Pelosi, minority leader, who underscored that Conyers is an icon, or do you, take issue with that? I mean, clearly she's referring to his long civil rights activity. He's, longest serving member of Congress right now. He's a Korean War veteran. What are your feelings about how she characterized him earlier today?
There's not a factual issue. Yes, John Conyers is a very distinguished guy. Look, we understand people are complicated. Very, very good people can occasionally do a bad thing, and bad people can do an occasionally good thing. No, I admire what Nancy Pelosi has done. I think she's a very skillful leader, one of the most skillful we've had. And what she was doing, she did the most important thing, which was to get him to step down from that leadership position. That's not the usual thing. Again, contrast him with Donald Trump, who's out there shilling for Roy Moore. You don't find many examples of the leadership stepping in, I believe, in this kind of way. And yes, I understand that she did it in a way that would kind of ease the concerns that people would have about, well, you're being unfair to this man who's been a civil rights leader for so long. But no, I thought Nancy Pelosi did it very well. And her description of John Conyers is an accurate one. In the 50 years in Congress, he's been in a leadership position on civil rights. That makes it all the more poignant if he's unable to remove this serious doubt that exists. But it doesn't deny the fact.
Mm-hmm. All right, 1964, first elected. All right, so I want to change subjects, if I could also ask you now about President Trump administration fighting for control of the nation's top consumer watchdog group, an agency known as the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, CFPB. And the president has slammed it as a total disaster. OMB Director Mulvaney has called it a real joke. And now the outgoing director names the deputy as the interim leader, but the Trump administration now says it's going to be the OMB Director Mulvaney. And many people are wondering who's going to show up to work tomorrow as the interim. Where are you on how this conflict has now arisen?
Well, I was one of the main drafters of the legislation working with Senator Elizabeth Warren, and I'm very proud of our creating the Consumer Bureau. Let me begin with the substance here. The Consumer Bureau is the most important protection in financial matters for the average citizen that we have ever had. And when people like Mulvaney and Trump attack it, it's very interesting that they have not given any specific. I wish people would ask them, well, what is it that they have done that you don't like? Going after Wells Fargo, helping people not have to pay student loan debt that was inappropriately coerced out of them, protecting people against unfair bank overdraft practices. The Consumer Bureau has been a very effective thing. And again, it is very interesting that for all this ranting about how terrible it is, they don't give you any specifics. Now, we have anticipated this. We knew that setting an agency up there with some independence to go after the largest, most powerful financial institutions and protect the average investor, depositor, citizen from them was going to generate a political backlash. So we deliberately wrote that statute, Senator Dodd, myself, with the advice of Elizabeth Warren and others, to make it somewhat independent and to give it protection against exactly what's happening. And so, yes, it is meant to be the person who was there. We gave the director a 5-year term and said the president couldn't fire him. And as part of that, to complete that 5-year term of independence, we said if he does leave or is not there for some reason, you have that process go forward. And by the way, the key thing is this. You know, Mick Mulvaney is supposed to be now, he's a little busy. He's got a government to fund. We have a government shutdown facing us. The notion that you take this budget director who hates the agency, who has a lot of other things to do, and you put him in charge is a sign of the contempt the Trump administration has, the anger it has at the notion that we would have someone to protect the average citizen. Nothing more clearly refutes this self-image of Donald Trump as a little guy's friend.
Is it your feeling that this is the avenue to deconstruct, if not do away with that agency altogether?
Oh, absolutely. You know, you're exactly right. And here's the deal. They can't do it legislatively. They would have liked to have done it legislatively, but they can't get any Democrats in the Senate to vote for that. They would need and they don't even have all the Republicans. Senator Collins of Maine voted for this. The Consumer Bureau, for all of the dislike that the right-wing ideologues have about it, is very popular with the American public. So the Republicans in the Senate don't want to vote on actually getting rid of it. So since they don't have the votes or even the courage to do this in a legislative way, this is a way to sabotage the agency. Put a man in there, the budget director, who's very, very conservative, nice fella, very, very conservative, opposed to the whole notion of consumer protection, and shut it down, even though you can't change it legislatively.
Perhaps anticipating this potential conflict, the outgoing director, Richard Cordray, wrote in his letter, to his staff, saying, first he wanted to share with everyone that I made this decision to reassign Leandra English to the position of deputy director, a reassignment she has accepted, and that has been effectuated accordingly. Upon my departure, she will become the acting director pursuant to Section 1011B5 of the Dodd-Frank Act, of your namesake, in considering how to ensure an orderly succession for this independent agency. But now orderly is the last thing, perhaps, potentially it has become.
Well, can I say,
how worrisome or bothered are you by this?
Very worried. It is, I was worried about a lot of their efforts to dismantle the Financial Reform Act. And they're not doing much of it because the public does not want to see a return to the irresponsible and abusive practices that led to the serious recession. But the point is this. They are claiming, the president is, that he has the right to appoint Mr. Mulvaney under what's called the Vacancy Act. Well, the Vacancy Act was passed in the 90s. The bill that created the consumer...
your act.
Exactly. Ordinarily, the later act amends the earlier one. And if we intended for that act to govern, we would have been wasting our time drafting what we did. We knew what the Vacancy Act was. It was in effect. And we said, and this is true in a number of areas of the Consumer Bureau, given the delicacy politically, the dangers they're in politically, because they take on the most powerful financial institutions in the country with all that they can do with contributions and other pressures to get members of Congress to get into them. We wanted to insulate them against being hindered from doing consumer protection. Okay. And so we gave them a 5-year term. We said they are funded in a different way. And part of what we did to protect them against the pressures we knew were coming is what Richard Cordray invoked.
All right. Former U.S. Congressman Barney Frank, thanks so much for being with us. I appreciate it and doing double duty for us today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.